And let me introduce the first speaker, David Barron. And I'll read this out just to make sure I cover many of the bases. So Professor David Barron is Emeritus Professor of Computer Science at Southampton University. Originally a physicist, he did a PhD in the Cavendish, during which he was a user of EDSAC. Like many of that era, having spent most of his time in the maths lab, he joined the lab staff, becoming in due time a university lecturer. He was much involved with the development of EDSAC-2 in the late 50s and early 60s, and then the Titan. He was leader of the Titan software effort, including both the Titan operating system and CPL, until he left Cambridge in 1967 to take a chair at Southampton. And apparently your webpage, these notes prepared by somebody else, says, I hope correctly, old-fashioned scholar, relic, of the past, yes. Your own words, very good. So to this charming and hugely important to us non-relic of the past, it's over to you.
My word, what a crowd. We're here to celebrate a very memorable event that took place exactly 60 years ago today in a rather unprepossessing building in Corn Exchange Street, originally called Old Anatomy, with a new nameplate saying Mathematical Laboratory, when the EDSAC ran its first program. Now, I've been trying to imagine what it must have been like. Someone loaded the paper tape into the tape reader, carefully making sure that the blank leader was under the reading head, and then they pressed the start button, and they would have heard the click, click, click of the uniselectors loading the initial orders. Because 60 years ago, the EDSAC-1 had the world's first read-only memory. 41 instructions were loaded into the bottom of the memory from mechanical telephone uniselectors making their way around. Then, once that was in, the program tape would start to go in. Fingers crossed, I imagine. It went right to the end, and the machine started calculating. There must have been a nerve-wracking 2 minutes whilst they waited for the overflow light to come on. But it didn't, and after 2 minutes or so, the teleprinter, which was attached to the machine, clunked into life and printed out a table of squares of the integers from 0 to 99, and they were all correct. So that's what we're here to remember. Now, a year before that, the world's first stored program was executed on the Manchester Baby. But that was just a proof of concept exercise, mainly to check that the Williams tube store actually worked. The program was entered from the console switches. The result was displayed in binary on a cathode ray tube. Somebody copied it down and either converted it to decimal or compared it with the binary they knew it should be and said it works. Whereas for the EDSAC, it was quite different. The program was on a paper tape. It was punched in a rudimentary assembly language, single character instruction codes, decimal addresses, and, as I said, loaded into the machine without any console switches, just press the start button. So it was a very memorable occasion, and ideally Maurice should be standing here to take the credit for what started as a glint in his eye and on that day materialized as a working machine. But he decided that someone else should do the hard work, so I stand here as the least worthy of his band of disciples. In a sense, I'm the ghost of computing past, because I'm one of the very few people left alive who actually used the EDSAC-1. We had the show of hands just now, and Peter Swinnerton-Dart put his hand up, Margaret Mars did, and others may have done. I couldn't see from where I was sitting. I have to tell you that Joyce Wheeler is unfortunately unable to join us today, and likewise Stan Kelly-Bootle, who was a graduate of the very first cohort of the Diploma in Numerical Analysis and Automatic Computing, which ran from 53 to 54 using the EDSAC-1. Incidentally, Stan sends his regards to anybody who might actually remember him these days. So, in this first lecture, I'm going to say a little bit about EDSAC in 3 parts. First, I'll talk about experiences as a user of EDSAC, because I was one. Then I'll say a bit about the hardware, and then finally, a bit about the software. So, the personal bit. It is, I think, in the nature of men, once they've passed a certain age, to wish they were younger. It's a feeling which I'm sure some of those present will share with me, having reached the stage at which the system doesn't operate to spec and the unscheduled maintenance of call-outs become increasingly frequent. But there was a time when I was young and foolish, when I actually wished I was older. And that was back in 1956, when I first encountered the EDSAC. Because then it occurred to me, if only my parents had got a move on, and I'd been 5 years older, I'd have been in here pretty near the start. As it was, I came in towards the end. I programmed the EDSAC in the year 56-57 and part of the following year, but thereafter my attention moved to EDSAC 2, and the EDSAC 1 was switched off in the summer of 58. So, like most of that generation, I came into computing entirely by accident. I knew about computers actually, because I got a copy of Bowden's book, Faster Than Thought, as a sixth form prize when I left school. But it never occurred to me that I would be the least bit involved with computers, because I was going to be a physicist. So I joined the Cavendish as a research student to be a physicist. I, in fact, joined the ionospheric physics group run by J.A. Ratcliffe, as some of you may recall. My supervisor, Ken Budden, outlined a problem area for me, which he had been working on, and it was to do with the reflection of radio waves from the ionosphere, and he had reduced it to a number of singularly intractable differential equations, and the only possible way ahead was numerical solution. And given the intractability of them, the idea of using a Brunsviga machine did not attract. So my supervisor, in one of those life-changing asides, said, "They've got this computer in the mathematical laboratory. Why don't you go over there and see if you can help?" And that changed my life forever, because I went over there and found it could help, and as Andy has told you, I stayed there. Once I'd finished my PhD in physics, I became a computer person and stayed on in the lab, and then went on to other places. Maurice very kindly offered me a desk in the mathematical laboratory. I suppose he sensed, with his sense of picking a good one, that I was going to be a keen user of the computer, and I joined a very disparate community. There were mathematicians, crystallographers, molecular biologists, theoretical chemists, physicists, astronomers, statisticians, and there may have been others. It was a very close-knit community with a very strong ethos of mutual assistance. I particularly remember that Maurice made it a rule that everybody, from the most senior to the most junior, assembled for coffee in a space underneath the EDSAC. And there all sorts of discussions took place. I personally learned an enormous amount at coffee, particularly from the late David Wheeler. So, writing a program for the EDSAC, it will seem very strange to most of you present, because you wrote it out on coding sheets, and you checked it. And then you checked it again, and checked it good, because you knew that if you made a mistake, you only got one chance in a day of running that program. So you checked it real good. And if you were happy with it, you then went to punch it on paper tape. The lab provided Creed tape perforators, which were used in the telegraph trade, typewriter-like keyboard, the big reel of paper tape that came out. No interpretation, so you never got a printed copy of your program, but you rapidly acquired the skill of holding the tape up to the light and reading off the Bordeaux code. Then, having got your program punched, you incorporated the subroutines, because the whole idea, as the title of Wilkes, Wheeler and Gill says, it's programming a computer with particular reference to a library of subroutines. So, again, there were machines to do this. Originally, it was a Creed perforator modified to have a tape reader attached. By the time I got there, they had freestanding tape duplicators, 2 tape readers, 1 tape punch, and a changeover switch. So you could read the program, change over, put a subroutine, until you eventually had a complete tape. You then, as the manual said, filled in a slip which indicated the kind of output you were expecting, which I thought was a wonderful play on words. And you took this with the tape to the computer room and hung it on a wire, which was the Q, operating system, with a single Q. And the operators would take the tape, next tape in sequence, put it in the reader, press the start button. If it worked, they'd look at the output and see if it more or less matched what you anticipated. If it didn't, they rather brutally just wrote on the slip the address at which it had stopped and handed it back to you. Now, this was all right for modest computer requirements. If you wanted serious computing, then, if you were lucky, you became an authorized user who was allowed to use the machine after the operators had finished. So you could use it in theory all night. In practice, you used it until it stopped working. But on a good night, you could get quite a long way. And 2 or 3 users would be allocated to each evening, and between themselves would share out the time. I found myself allocated to join an astronomy student called Joyce Blackler. It may be coincidence that after a year of working the shift with me, she decided to marry David Wheeler. So, that's the sort of personal bit. Now, the EDSAC hardware. There's a great vogue in television at the moment for people to go to sleep and wake up in 1980 or 1973 or something. Now, if one of you went to sleep tonight and woke up in, 60 years ago, in the 50s, you would find yourself in a very different world. You wouldn't be in a glossy building like this, as I said, you'd be in a rather scruffy building in Corn Exchange Street. The thing that would probably most impress you would be the sheer physical size of the machine. There's a general view of the EDSAC. All these 19-inch racks, each filled with chassis containing the electronics, to one side, not visible in this picture, was the memory, the mercury tubes in what looked like a couple of coffins, and on the other side is the control panel. Now, if you were to look closely at this, you would see that it's, again, totally alien because it's made up of vacuum tubes, thermodynamic valves in UK parlance. 3,000 of them, taking about 12 kilowatts of power. Now, the thing about a thermodynamic tube is it has a filament to heat the cathode. And the filament, like the filament in your incandescent light bulb, eventually burns out. Now, before the machine started working, there was much speculation as to whether it would ever work or whether the valves would fail faster than the technicians could put new ones in. In fact, it did work. As I say, sometimes for quite long periods, sometimes for not very long. So, as I say, there was no fancy graphical interface or control panel, a rather homemade control panel, which I'll show you in close up. There you see on the left the tape reader. There's a couple of empty tape spools there. There's a series of switches and buttons you can use, and underneath the panel are the buttons for the engineers and switches. The interesting bit here perhaps is the cathode ray tubes, because you could use them to display the contents of selected parts of memory. And this was very useful. If you had a program going which was supposed to converge, it was quite helpful to watch the register which indicated how fast it was converging. And in particular, if that number started increasing, you knew you'd made a nasty mistake. Sandy Douglas, who again I'm afraid is not well enough to be with us today, used this to produce the first computer game, a game of noughts and crosses, where the board and the current state were displayed by putting particular bit patterns in particular registers in the memory. You made your move, I forget the precise detail, but some manipulation of the switches, and then the machine made its move, and until you got used to it, it beat you. Perhaps the other thing I should draw your attention to on this slide, just between the control panel and the tape reader, is a telephone dial. This was a wonderful sort of jeu d'esprit by David Wheeler. You could dial in a single digit from 0 to 9. To do it, you had to call a subroutine, I something, but reading the spec of that subroutine, it said working registers used 0. In fact, David being David, had merely manipulated the initial orders to do the work and then put the initial order back again, so he didn't need any working space in your part of the memory. So, our time traveller is in a different world. It's a tiny memory, 1,024 words of 17 bits. In fact, when that first program ran, there were only 512 words of 17 bits. It was a very slow machine, about 1.5 milliseconds to add or subtract, 4.5 milliseconds to do a multiplication. Division, don't ask. Division was done by software in a subroutine that probably took about 200 milliseconds. And you rapidly acquired the skill of minimizing the number of divisions required in a computation. The arithmetic, again, totally strange to a modern person, was a fixed point, numbers between -1 and +1, with the sign digit to the left of the binary point. Alternatively, you could scale an integer to go down to the far end of the register. So when you were programming, you had to make sure that nowhere in the calculation at any intermediate stage would you get a number which exceeded the range -1 to just short of +1. So you had to insert scaling factors, and this could be the most difficult part of the program. But having done that, then you're away. Now, why was the machine so slow? The answer is that because, like all the other machines being developed at the same time, it was a serial machine. Nowadays, we expect everything to happen in parallel. These machines were serial. Words were processed 1 bit at a time, starting at the least significant end and working through. The benefit of this, of course, was that the actual hardware became much simpler, because the adder was now just a single adder with 3 inputs and 2 outputs. 3 inputs, 1 from each operand and 1 carry digit. 2 outputs, the output digit and the carry, which was merely fed back with a 1 pulse delay. So the fact it was a serial machine stemmed in fact from the fact that the memory was likewise serial. In the early years after the war, Maurice managed to get himself across the Atlantic to the Moore School, summer school, in which John von Neumann and his colleagues talked about the design of an automatic computer. Incidentally, the account of how he got himself across the Atlantic is well worth reading if you can pick up a copy of his memoirs somewhere. At the time, it was generally believed that the only workable memory for a computer was a delay line. That is to say, you have a string of pulses, you put it into a tank of mercury with a quartz crystal at either end. It gets converted into ultrasonic pulses, which make their way relatively slowly down the pipe, come out at the other end, and then you can reshape them and put them back in again. So there you've got a memory. Put a gate on the front end, you can insert new information. Put a gate on the back end, you can extract information to go either to the arithmetic unit or the control unit, depending whether you've got an instruction or a number to deal with. So, as I said, that was the pretty well universal way of storing, except for Manchester, which used the Williams tube. But we won't say any more about Manchester. So, the basic unit in the memory was 18 bits, of which 17 were used so as to give you an empty pulse between the words. 17 bits gives you a sign bit, and the rest of it for the fixed point number, or it gives you 5 bits for an order code, 11 bits for an address, and 1 bit at the end for a special purpose I'll come to. Now, I'm sure the bright young people at the back are saying, he said 1,024 words and he said 11 bits. Well, that was the case initially, but of course nothing goes to waste, because when David Wheeler decided to put a B register on the machine, he could use that spare bit to indicate that the address should be modified by the contents of the B register. There was a mechanism for expressing this in the punch tape version of your program. A lot of us merely added the 1024 to the address. In fact, I had a hand crank desk calculator with 1024 set in one of the registers, so I could just key in my address, crank the handle and read off. because I couldn't trust myself to add 1 or 2 4 all the time. So 17 bits doesn't give you much numerical precision, but the designers, Maurice and his team, had thought of that, and you could combine 2 17-bit words, numbers, into a 35-bit long number. And again, the bright young people say 2 times 17 is not 35. And the answer is there was that empty pulse between the words, and if the machine knew it was a long number, it knew not to expect an empty pulse in the middle. The programming manual rather dismissively said, the way this works is of little interest except to those who write input routines. So there we have the machine, mercury tanks for the memory, 32 tanks, 32 words in each, smaller mercury tanks for the various registers. So the accumulator was itself a mercury tank. It was a single address machine, so every instruction required an operand from the accumulator if it was doing arithmetic. The design was remarkably cleverly thought out because, for example, when you do a multiply, you get a double-length product. And it was decided they would keep the double-length product and, if need be, round off if someone only wanted the 35-bit version. This could have been done in a single tank, but clever design, there were 2 tanks in sequence, which made it possible to get the 2 halves of the accumulator out without having to wait for the whole lot to go around. And there are lots and lots of features like that in the logical design of the EDSAC. The best place to read it up, actually, when I was thinking about what I should say today, I spoke to Maurice on the phone and said, well, what shall I say? And he gave me the old-fashioned academic's answer, it's all in my book. The book he was referring to was Automatic Digital Computers, published in 1956 in this country, 58 in the States. Not only does it give you a blow-by-blow account of the design, hardware and software of the EDSAC, it gives you background information about the ENIAC and the EDVAC, the Morse school machine, and in a pull-out diagram there's a sketch of a design for a parallel EDSAC. You see, back in 1956. The book, of course, is long out of print, but last time I looked there were still 17 copies available at ABA Books, about half of them from this country and half of them from the States, and they'll set you back about 25 quid. Well worth it, and I don't get any commission. So, that's a very brief account of the hardware. Now, when it came to the software, the time traveller would probably feel a bit more at home, although there would be some nasty surprises waiting for him as he turned over the stones. The machine was designed from the start to be used by non-experts. Most of the other machines being developed at the time were developed to be used by the people in the lab, and when they got it working they would think about what to do with it next. This machine right from the start was to be used by scientists for a wide range of disciplines. The initial orders, as I said, gave you an alphabetic single letter order code, A for add, S for subtract, V for multiply, and so it goes on. Decimal address, and a letter at the end, F for a short operand and D for a long operand. So the machine, when you sent something to the control unit, it knew whether you were talking about a long operand or a short one. By contrast, I said I wouldn't mention Manchester again, but I must get one more dig in. The people at Manchester were writing their programs in binary, converting them in 5-bit sections into rows on a teleprinter tape, and then punching that and feeding it in. So this programming system would look reasonably at home to anybody who programmed in using an assembler. Now, of course, I wrote that down, and I suddenly thought, people who've used assembler, probably almost as rare as people who use EDSAC. But on the other hand, I did note in one of the posters outside, he did say that the students here are taught assembler, in which case my congratulations, Andy. So, the second part of the familiar aspect of the software will be the subroutines. If you merely substitute the word function for subroutine, you then feel at home, because the subroutine was a self-contained piece of code which took arguments and delivered results. It could even take arguments which were the address of another subroutine. In other words, formal functions in modern language. So that would make you feel at home as well. Subroutines were not just library subroutines. The users were encouraged to structure their program in subroutines so as to minimize the knock-on effect of a mistake. Because if you had to insert an extra instruction somewhere in the program, everything else moved down one, and therefore lots of jump addresses might have the wrong destination. So keeping subroutines short maintained some control over that. David Wheeler's initial orders had provided the absolutely essential feature of addressing relative to the start of a subroutine. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been much use. Now, the shock for the time traveller would come when he inquired, how do subroutines get called and how does control get back? And the answer was, by using what was a feature of this kind of machine, that because the instructions and the numbers were in the same memory, you could bung an instruction in the accumulator, monkey about with it, and then put it back again. And so, for a subroutine, before you went in, you recorded, roughly speaking, the address of where you were. That you were 2 behind where you should come back, but that's a minor detail. And then at the beginning of the subroutine, the content of the accumulator will be monkeyed with to generate a transfer instruction which would go back to the right place, and this was deposited at the end of the subroutine. And you will see, of course, this has the attraction that you can nest subroutines without any problems. So that was the way subroutine linkage was first done. Later on, I mentioned David Wheeler added a B register, and so there was a new kind of subroutine, the B routine, where the return address was held in the B register in what would appear an entirely modern feature to our time traveller. The old hands, I must say, tended to stick with the old version. Modifying addresses, if you got it right, was a particularly satisfying operation. Nothing more satisfying than manufacturing an instruction and putting it down right in front of your toes so it would be obeyed next. And as I say, we got our fun in simple ways in those days. The modification of orders also, of course, was necessary to do loops through vectors. Before the B register, with indexed addressing, you had to go through the loop once, then modify the instructions which were picking the data from memory, add the right constant to them, put them back where they were, go around the loop again. So it really was at the heart of the programming system. Fortunately, a lot of people didn't have to do much programming because there were no less than 87 subroutines in the subroutine library, which you could rely upon to work because they'd been thoroughly tested. And if anybody put something in the library that didn't work, then they would get the sharp end of Maurice's tongue. So we never did. The subroutines, they were mostly numeric, trigonometrical functions, special functions, quadrature, differential equations. But there were also such modern things as interpretive floating point. This was, in fact, floating decimal. Of course, I don't think anybody ever used it because the machine was so slow anyway that the thought of losing all those cycles interpreting floating decimal, it was probably worth the effort of doing your scaling factors and getting them right. So, just to round up, three things I think to take from the EDSAC experience. First of all, it demonstrated that a machine designed for workaday use by non-experts was a perfectly viable proposition. It also demonstrated that an automatic digital computer was a viable proposition that actually worked long enough to do something useful. It introduced a whole load of scientists to the possibilities of using numerical work methods in their work. And this was something which expanded immensely when the EDSAC 2 came along, with its much improved processing power. And then the third thing, I think, the lesson to take away is how much was done with such slender resources. You know, what would you do with less than 2 kilobytes of memory in which you've got to put the program and the data? And you're working in fixed point 2's complement. The people using the EDSAC did some real science. It was tedious, took a long time, a lot of time burning the midnight oil if the machine kept working, but the science got done. And I think that's the lesson I would like to take away. Nowadays, well, I recently had a problem with my fridge freezer, and the chap came along, he said, "What's wrong?" I said, "It's tripping the circuit breaker." So he took the panel off and saw the burn marks and said, "That's it, it's the control module." So he pulled that out, put a new one in, fine. He left me the control module, and I looked at it, a rough estimation, it probably had the same processing power as the EDSAC, and that was just to drive a fridge freezer. So, with that, I will hand over to the next speaker.